Good morning on the West Coast, good afternoon on the East Coast. Welcome to Ridge Vineyard's Spring 2015 virtual tasting. My name is David Amadia. I'm the head of sales and marketing at Ridge, and it'll be my pleasure to host and moderate today's tasting. We're coming to you live this morning from Montebello, our estate here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We're sitting about 2,200 feet above Silicon Valley, otherwise known as Santa Clara Valley. And about 20 miles to my left is the Pacific Ocean. We'll be tasting with you 6 wines today, our spring releases. So the first thing I'd like to do is just to go through the wines we're going to be tasting quickly in their tasting order. So the first wine will be the 2013 Estate Chardonnay. Our second wine will be the 2013 Paso Robles Zinfandel. Third, 2013 East Bench Zin. Fourth, the 2013 Geyserville. The fifth wine will be our Estate Merlot 2012. And sixth, the 2012 Estate Cabernet. These are all very young wines, just released on the 1st of April. We double decanted all these wines an hour before the tasting, and hopefully you've been able to do the same before pouring the wines out. Hopefully you do have the wines poured out and your tasting mats out in front of you and you're set to go. This is an interactive event, as always. It's a conversation. We really thrive on your questions and comments, so please send them through, either through the chat function on live stream, or feel free to send us an email at wholesale@ridgewine.com, and we'll be more than happy to pass those along to our panel. And let me introduce our panel this morning. We have 4 key members of our production staff with us, and introducing them. On my far left is Eric Bauer, our Vice President of Winemaking for Montebello, right here at the estate. And Eric is in his 21st year here at Ridge. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Immediately to Eric's right is David Gates. David is Vice President of Vineyard Operations. He's in charge of all of our estate vineyards here at Montebello, Lytton Springs, East Bench, Geyserville, as well as all of our growers as well. And David is in his 26th year here at Ridge Vineyards. 27th, and I miss a year? Who's counting
vintage.
at this point, huh?
27th vintage, yeah.
Next, I'd like to introduce John Olney. John's immediately to my left. John is Vice President of Winemaking at our Lytton Springs facility in Dry Creek Valley. And John is in his 19th year here at Ridge. John, thank you for making the drive this morning and coming to join us here at Montebello. And fourth, I'd like to introduce Paul Draper. Paul Draper is our head winemaker, our Chief Executive Officer, and Paul is in his 46th year here at Ridge Vineyards. That's right. So thank you all for being here. Before we start with the tasting, I thought we'd take a moment to address an issue that's been in the news quite a bit lately, and that's the drought here in California. The governor of California, Governor Brown, just over a week ago, in a press conference, mandated 25% rationing across the state. And yesterday in an interview, he was quoted as saying the drought is unprecedented in recorded history. So that's certainly newsworthy. So we want to take a moment to talk about the impact of drought on Ridge. And maybe I'll ask David Gates to start off the conversation from a vineyard perspective, how it's impacting us, how we're mitigating it, and where we stand with rainfall this year for this winter.
Sure, thanks, David. Well, the good news is that this year we are not quite normal. We're 2/3 of normal as opposed to half of normal for all of 2014. So at Montebello, we just got just under 2 inches of rain, this last little system that came through. And so that puts us at 23.5 inches, 23.4 inches. At Lytton Springs, we're a little bit better, but we're still a little below normal. We're at 33.5 inches thereabouts. Okay. And Geyserville just maybe 22.5, so a little bit less than Lytton, even though they're only a mile apart. So that's the good news. The bad news is most of that rain came in big chunks, and so most of it did not go into the ground. It went off into the reservoirs, which is good for some people, for people in California that rely on reservoirs, but not necessarily good for the grapes. The main thing that we do to try to mitigate for this lack of rain is make sure that we don't try to stress the vines too much in terms of crop level. Not that we get big yields anyway, but we are pretty vicious in the way we are suckering the last couple of years to make sure that we don't try to ask too much of the vines and don't grow too large of a leaf canopy, because that is the driving force for using up water in the soil. The other thing we try to do is get the weeds cut and disked in where we disk as quickly as possible, and to keep on it so that they don't compete with the vines as much for water. Okay. Other than that, it's kind of as usual. We have some neat little monitoring devices that attach directly to the vines. They're called sap flow sensors that tell us how the vine is responding to its environment, and as long as the vine is reacting and able to use up water or translocate the water as needed due to the day temperatures and whatnot, the vine's fine. It doesn't need water. It's when it starts to decouple from that where it has to shut its stomates and not respire during the day. It's a little geeky, but a little technical. Yeah, but as long as the vine is responding to the day, then it's fine with water, and that's very different from using soil probes for monitoring the water in the soil, because that just tells you how much water is in the soil. It doesn't tell you what's available to the vine. If you're looking at the vine's doing all the complex the complex happenings that have it working with the atmosphere and kind of doing all that integration for you. So if the vine's happy, you're happy.
You don't have to worry about it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'd like to mention one basic thing that we do here. That from the beginning, well, David just went to a conference of people that are not irrigating their vineyards. Right. And I said to him, what percentage of California vineyards is that? And he said, well, it's certainly less than 10%, and it may even be 2% or something. And the point being is that virtually everybody irrigates every year for the life of the vine, all the way from the time it's planted to the time it's torn out. And they tend, although it's changing, we hope, to do relatively shallow irrigations, but fairly continuous. So a lot of irrigations throughout the growing season. Right. Okay, here, from the beginning, what we've done is to give a couple, 2 or 3 deep or heavy irrigations. Well, first to say, as most of you know, in California, if you plant a vine with roots, you're down this deep, or a rose bush, if you don't irrigate it in the summer for the first few years in a rose bush continually, it's going to dry out and die. So we have no rain from May, say, till late September in an average year. So what we've found is that by several heavy irrigations, you can drive the roots down in the course of the first 8 or 10 years and get them really deep in the soil. One, where they're going to have the unique elements of your soil, but 2, they're going to get to an area where they can find water through the growing season. So after 8 or 10 years, we don't irrigate. And we think that a lot of California vineyards, depending on their soils, could do something like that, which would really require much less water over the lifetime of the vine than what's being done now. And we think the intensity and the quality is greater if you do it that way.
If you get the roots down deep.
Yeah. For example, behind us are Cabernet vines planted without trellis back in the mid to late 40s. They were probably, they were hand irrigated around each vine for, who knows, 8 years. And for the last 55, 58 years, have not been irrigated at all. And admittedly, yields are low, but they're alive and kicking. And I should say, looking at them again, they're only out, this is Cabernet, only out about this much. Virtually anywhere else in California, Napa and so on, they're out this much to this much. So that's part of the fact that we're in a cool climate. And so we're always late in starting and late in finishing.
So Eric, in terms of the winery, is obviously requires quite a bit of water as well. but we've made some investments in some bioreactors and things of that nature.
Yeah, so we've put in a water recycling system a few years back. Kind of after that last 3-year drought that we went through, we really felt it was time to put in a system to recycle all the water from barrel washing and tank washing.
And that pretty much goes now onto young vines, isn't that right?
Yeah, yeah. So essentially the block of vines just above the winery has been irrigated with that water only since we've installed it.
Are we reclaiming roughly?
As much as we can put in it every day.
Right.
So, you know, the wine work throughout the year is variable depending on what barrels need to be racked that day. You know, our heaviest water use is really during the harvest, where we can easily run through 5,000 to 6,000 gallons of water.
Sure.
But for the remainder of the year, it could be 1,200 gallons to 2,000, really depending on the workload.
That's still
And
quite
we've
a bit.
put in a lot of water conservation there, as well as, you know, reducing our work week. So we're actually getting a lot more accomplished in a 4-day, 10-hour period, you know, which at least lightens up not having to do setup on that 5th day.
Mm-hmm.
So that itself has saved a couple thousand gallons a week
Okay.
in water use. But basically the bioreactor has really been a terrific tool at being able to recover all that water.
And John, at Lytton, we recover into to a pond. It's a significant amount of water that we recycle there as well.
Yeah, we have 2 wastewater ponds, and actually all of the water that we use in production, so everything we use for washing barrels, hoses, tanks, goes into the ponds. It's aerated, and then we're able to reuse it.
That's awesome. Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna irrigate out
Yeah.
tomorrow.
We're going to utilize the ponds.
Yeah.
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 Okay. There you go. Well, good. I think that's a really good update on where we stand relative to the drought and the things we're doing at Ridge relative to the drought to conserve and mitigate the impact. So let's get going with the tasting. The first wine is the Estate Chardonnay. And Eric, why don't I ask
Yeah.
you to kick that one off for us?
Okay. Well, this, of course, is from the 2013 vintage, the dry year. We got quite a bit of the rain in a few months at the start of winter. So as we really got into the growing season, as the vines budded out early that year, the rains ended and it was fairly dry for the remainder of the growing season. These Chardonnay blocks are on the north slopes of Montebello in the limestone soil. And luckily the limestone retains water, so we've got, you know, good water resources for these vines, and they made it through that dry summer. And we were harvesting early because of the whole season starting a month early. And we picked by taste as we walked through, hiked the blocks, sampling grapes. We really looked at, you know, areas of stress on the vines versus the areas where there's a little bit more underground water resources where the vines were greener. So we did a lot of separate picking of the 12 different parcels and brought the fruit in one block at a time and did a whole cluster pressing, you know, gently extracting the juice. That juice was then allowed to sit overnight in a tank, and we were able to chill it down to 55 Fahrenheit. And then the next day sent it to barrel for natural yeast fermentations in the 130-year-old cellar below ground. Nice, cool environment, which helped really prolong the primary fermentation. So it went about 5 months out to get to dryness for each of the lots. And then as soon as all the barrels were dry, we went through, topped up everything really well, began doing the batonnage, the barrel stirring, for another 5 months throughout the natural malolactic fermentation. And then we sat down, tasted, and selected 7 parcels for the estate, which is basically the lots that have really good fruit focus, elegance, nice oily texture, that come together to make a really beautiful Chardonnay for early drinking enjoyment. And then separately, you know, for the first time in several years, we were able to actually put together a pretty sizable production of Montebello Chardonnay from the blocks that were really stressed and really produced amazing, distinctive
I
quality.
think that's an important point from a practical standpoint, because people are complaining about the lack of Chardonnay this year. And it wasn't a small Chardonnay harvest per se, but
yeah, I mean, it was a little bit smaller than the 2012 vintage. It's just in the selection between the two wines, it was almost 50-50.
so we'll be seeing more Chardonnay, but it'll be next year with
Next
the
year,
release of the
yeah.
Montebello Chardonnay. So
Yeah, so once this was assembled, then we racked off clean, held it in tank, let it settle further, and then at the end of January, we went ahead and racked off again very clean to the bottling tank so that we could bottle without filtration.
Okay.
And since the end of January, it's just been sitting in bottle, getting a little bit of age on it, and it's just now tasting pretty nice.
Really well.
It's brilliant wine.
So, I mean, really good acidity in the wine. You know, we attempted to pick earlier than we normally do just because of the drought, the stress on the vines, and really trying to get good flavor and yet hold the acidity. So we did pick early.
It's a beautiful wine.
So typically, we separate the estate from the Montebello. With the red wine, which will have the estate at the end here. We've looked at the history of the blocks and really designated the ones that 80% of the time produce a more accessible, somewhat softer wine than the others, and those we treat slightly differently in the winery. And so it's kind of predetermined, even though there is a move back and forth with a few lots between the estate and the Montebello in the selection and the tasting.
Okay.
But with Chardonnay, it's
no,
really
it
there
moves
may be
around.
there may be a few. Are there a few parcels that are pretty typical of going toward Montebello?
Yeah, there's the 2 acre.
Yeah.
Yeah, that little block.
But then the rest
Tends
it
to be Montebello. The
could
rest,
change
yeah,
each year.
completely random
And
and
so,
unpredictable.
We've really
until
got
we
to
really
taste.
get to the 10th month of barrel aging to taste and see which lots have that distinctive minerality that are more Montebello-like than the estate lots.
Yeah, and just for all of our customers, all of you out there, we attempted. David said, "Oh my God, we don't have any estate to sell. Can't you guys add some Montebello to the estate?" So we actually, just to, not that we were going to, but we wanted to keep him happy.
Yeah, we tasted it.
We put some Montebello in, and we didn't like the estate as well with the Montebello added as we did, as you see it here.
Yeah.
And we said, sorry, David, we're going to have a big vintage of Montebello. And yes, the market is used to
I'm just going to forward all the
estate.
calls up to you, Paul.
Exactly. Anyway, so that's the full story on this.
Yeah, and the Montebello is still sitting in barrels, so we're hoping to bottle that in the next couple of months as it really settles out, because it's still on its lee. You know, we do like that long surly aging for the
And this
Montebello
will be
Chardonnay.
one of the longer surly agings for the even for the Montebello.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now we're going to move to 3 Zinfandels, all from the 13 vintage. The first one's from Paso. David, I'll ask you to kick this one off. Maybe talk a little bit about the vintage 13 in Paso specifically, and about this wine from the Ducey Ranch.
Sure, thanks David. So we've been making the Paso Robles wine from Benito Ducey's little vineyard just south of the town of Paso Robles. The first year was 1967. It's actually a pre-Paul Draper wine. But from 76 on, we went back in 76. Paul went back in 76, and we've been making it every year since. And Benny's been farming it ever since he was a very young man, when his older brother Dante, who just this last winter passed away. He almost made it to 90, Dante did. But when Dante went off to the war, Benny started farming it and has farmed his home ranch ever since.
Was he about age 12 or 14
maybe
or
maybe
something?
14. Yeah, he was.
Took over from his brother and his father.
Yep, and he still does the tractor work. He has a guy that helps him with pruning and suckering and whatnot, but he does all the tractor work himself still. Great guy. It's sitting on a riverbed, fairly recent soils, just south of town, and it gets ripe reliably in early September. 2013 was no difference. The biggest difference in 2013 is the rainfall was about half of normal. So what that meant is that when the grapes started to get ripe, they got ripe in a hurry because the vines just kind of ran out of gas. We picked it, ended up picking it with a little bit of second crop about 4 weeks after the very first of the grapes came in, but the majority of the grapes came in early September. Like all of our Zinfandel, this is the whole full crush, I should say, and then it goes to tanks with natural fermentations that native yeast, native malolactic. It one thing we love to do with Paso, because they're big berries and it's a softer wine, we do some submerged cap, which this year I think
Yeah,
was
we
about
did.
third.
Yeah, about 37%
Yeah,
of it was
great.
in submerged cap tanks.
And typical of a Paso Robles, and this is moderate alcohol for Paso, good ripeness, but not overripe or anything. It's this really juicy wine that's soft and very easy to drink. So
It's
that's
also a lot of acid this year too.
very
I mean,
much
it
so.
was really nice.
The last few years it's
Yeah.
had good acidity.
Good acidity in it.
So when you say submerged cap, Dave and Eric, you're talking about like a grate that
The grid system that we have on the inside of the fermenters
And the
that can
purpose
hold
of
the
that
skin.
is-
Well, accentuating extraction of color and tannin.
Okay. Very
What's
good.
the-
Works great on Zin, not so well on Cabernet.
No.
We experimented with that too, but
Yeah.
because with Cab you've got to control how much you're extracting. Zin, you can basically use all the extraction you've got for
won't go over
both
the
color
top.
and tannin.
No.
And so holding the grapes constantly in the juice is that long, slow, complete
And we're still doing
extraction.
pump overs, so we're drawing juice
Yeah.
off
Oh,
twice
yeah.
a day, aerating it, and then putting it back over. But while we're not pumping over, at least we're still down in the juice, extracting color and tannin.
Terrific.
Yeah, and it's funny, and submerged cap doesn't really work well with Carignan either. and I don't know
it
why.
gets
It's
really tannic.
very gritty,
Yeah.
gritty tannins, which you don't think of Carignan as a really tannic
Let
wine.
alone things like the little bit of Grenache.
Oh,
that-
yeah, forget it.
No, forget it,
1% Grenache or something. Yeah.
So the next two Zins are both from northern Sonoma County, the East Bench and the Geyserville. So John, can you tell us a little bit about 13 and that part of the world and what the vintage was like?
Yeah, sure. So 2013, of course, as everyone knows, there's very little rainfall, and it was also a fairly mild winter. So when we got a little bit of warmth in the spring, the vines really woke up quite early. And in terms of like degree days, 2013 was one of the warmest harvests in recent years. But the important thing, especially for Zinfandel, especially when you look at things like the East Bench, which is 100% Zinfandel, we didn't get the sort of intense heat spikes that we can sometimes, which really can drive the sugars up more than we like, and also cause some sort of raisoning. So we got nice even ripening throughout the growing season, and then sort of a cool off right before harvest started, and just some really ripe but not overripe fruit. So there's just a really in the Zinfandel you see a lot of that nice sort of dark brambly fruit that's gives the wine a lot of middle, a lot of texture to it.
Terrific. Well, let's talk specifically now about the East Bench, the 13 vintage. I mean, important to note, this is our first wine that's labeled on the back label and our ingredients that it's made from 100% certified organic grapes. So that's important to note and for people to know about, but let's talk specifically about the wine.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this is a single vineyard that is divided up into 7 different parcels, and we harvest each parcel separately. And as we mentioned, it is one of the few vineyards that we have along with the Paso. We actually have them side by side here, which is 100% Zinfandel. And so we ferment each parcel separately and then go back and taste them blind and really select out the best ones in any given vintage. And in 2013, we were able to put 5 of them together to make this wine. As David mentioned, this is one of our vineyards which has been certified organic for a couple of years now?
This is
Since 2011.
It's the first time it made the label, though.
First time made the label. All right.
And and one quick thing to say about organically grown, which is true of this, is that it's important for the grapes. However, it says nothing about what you do in the winery, which is one reason that we have the ingredient label on there that shows how little we did, how little in terms of any additions. They're the ones that have been used for 100, 200 years and are totally non-invasive. And so the combination of how it was grown, i.e. organically, and then how it was made
Yeah.
really tells you what the wine is about.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I mean, organically grown grapes says nothing. Once the grapes reach the door of the winery, what happens after that can be anything, right? And that's why we have the ingredient labeling, to let people know that once it gets to the winery door, this is all that happens to the grapes in the winemaking process. And I think one of the things, I don't have the label in front of me, but with East Bench, we actually talk about a water addition, I believe, in this, which I was at an event last night and a master of wine came to the table and read that, and he goes, I have never seen that before on a label. He was blown away by the fact that we were disclosing that. But it's an interesting thing that people should know about. Yeah.
And I think with the ingredient labels, when someone sees 1.1%
Yes.
water addition or 2% water addition, they say, my God, if they're willing to put that on the label, this must be complete. This must be really what they did. And of course, the federal authorities, the TTB, insist that if you're going to voluntarily put the ingredients on the label, it must include absolutely everything that was brought into that wine. And they're really strict on that.
So a question we have that's come from the audience is, that's great. We're happy to see the first organically grown wine released by Ridge. When can we see more? When can we see the rest of the wines? And David, that's mostly a question for you because you're in charge of the certification process. So
Yeah, it is.
where do we
He
stand?
just wrote an
we're there.
article which will appear in the newsletter, the wholesale.
Well, it'll go out on our wine blog, I believe.
Yeah, and that will be every detail. But in the meantime,
Yeah.
say you've got East Bench.
Yeah, the short answer is Geyserville, 2015.
2015.
Lytton, there's a possibility of 2015 depending on what blocks. And then for sure, Lytton, our estate Petit Syrah that we make, by 2018 that will all be organic.
And what about here on the
Montebello,
Montebello, we're
there's a chance to make it this year, 2015.
2015?
Yeah.
Except in the Chardonnay, right?
Chardonnay, not
Chardonnay
yet,
is the
yeah.
one area that we're working on.
And already, I mean, it isn't like all of that is getting certified in the next couple of years
No,
or
no,
this year.
Yeah.
It's that we're already hundreds of acres, whatever, a couple
Well, I
hundred
think
acres
we're
are
over
already
200 up in
certified.
Sonoma County
Yeah,
and
I
100
mean,
here.
yeah, that's.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we talked about this before.
Yeah.
It kind of blew me away. There's a lady Pam Strayer who has Organically Yours or something like
website.
that.
Yeah.
A website, and so she did quite a bit of work, looking at who's certified organic and who isn't, and it turns out that in Santa Cruz Mountains, it's a no-brainer. We're the largest grower in the Santa Cruz Mountains, so it makes sense that we'd be the largest organic grower with the acreage that we have. But Sonoma, we're not a big fish in Sonoma County by any means on the vineyard end, but we are by double the largest organic grower. The next largest is the Benzinger family at a little less than 100 acres, and we're a little over 200. So that blew me away. I had no idea.
Blew us all away, I think.
Yeah, it did.
Absolutely. So I guess the question is that if we're, it's percentage-wise, we're about 90% of the way, 80-90% of the way towards all of our estate acres. What's the challenges with to get over the last hump? What's the biggest challenge for it?
It's mainly weed control, erosion, and because of that, or erosion concerns with weed control. Weed control under the vines for organic is all manual tillage, basically. And that when you loosen the soil on slopes, you have a higher incidence of erosion. So we have to really go carefully on that. There's another new organic herbicide out, which is kind of an oxymoron, organic herbicide, but that seems to, it just got registered. Unfortunately, the registration process is very lengthy in California, and it got out to us a little bit late. It was late February, early March before we could actually get it. The weeds were pretty much mature and hardened by then, so this is basically a weed oil that will burn back the weeds contact only. And so it does a really good job of that, but if the grasses especially, if they've already have an established root system, it just knocks them back, it doesn't kill them. But it's something that if we spray it a little bit earlier in the year, starting in this fall, I think it's a real option. So that might be the trigger that allows us to get all the Chardonnay in organic as well. So
Terrific. Yeah. Good. Well, let's move to the third Zinfandel in the lineup, the 13 Geyserville. And Eric, can I ask you to talk to this
Oh,
one?
sure, yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, this is from terrific vintage. Most of this fruit came in the early part of September towards the end. It was an early harvest, and just beautiful quality and concentration. Not overripe, just like John said, uniform ripening, which is something we don't see all that often with Zinfandel. But this year it came in just beautiful quality. 30% of the fruit hit fermenters with the submerged cap to again help with the extraction. It was in my opinion, a slightly more structured vintage. So we did have to watch the tannin extraction, and we were able to really flesh it out with some really nice structure. So we did our best to control tannins, fermented the 25 different vineyard parcels separately, blind tasted, and held out about 35%. So we really narrowed down the selection to those lots that really had that terrific character, Geyserville character, with that nice alluvial soil, the minerality, dark berry fruit.
It's showing beautifully.
It's
showing
I mean,
quite a
it's
bit of
a real-
structure.
It definitely is, yeah. It's a
Yeah.
more structured vintage.
Yeah.
Definitely if you compared it to the 12 was much more elegant. We did actually find the 12 vintage with some egg whites just before bottling, whereas this vintage, we tasted it, we followed it all throughout barrel aging and just really liked the integration that it had as far as its tannin structure.
Well, speaking of that, that is another question we have had from the audience, is looking at three really terrific vintages here in California, the 12, 13, and 14. And, over the course of time, which one will be the better vintage?
We'll have to wait
I know.
probably 5, 8, 10 years to
They're
see
all
how
gonna
they
age
develop.
really well.
It's not really
Yeah.
clear at this point.
Now, what did happen, as we sort of mentioned with the drought, is that even though 12 was the first drought year, there were huge rains in December, but the temperatures were still pretty cold. And so it meant that bud break did not come particularly early. In fact, it was pretty normal, I think, which meant we had our timing of harvest in 12, as we get into the Merlot and the Cab, was, typical. Late September and so on. September for Zinfandels, October for Cabernets and Merlots.
Normal for us.
And for normal.
Yeah.
But then 13, which we're looking at here with the Zins, the first time there was a
early, yeah.
mild,
We actually
dry,
ended
mild winter. So we got this, February bud break? Late February.
early.
And so 13 and 14, and who knows, now 15.
Yeah.
It meant that the season started unusually
Earlier.
and we're harvesting even Cabernet in September.
Cabernet. Yeah, the
instead of
Cabernet was
October.
coming in at the same
That's-
time as Zin was
Yeah,
coming
the
in.
estate and the Montebello have always come in principally in October, even into November.
Yeah.
This year, in 14, I should say.
Well,
not-
13 as well.
13
We
as
were
well.
harvesting both Cab and Zin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's just been.
the big effect of the drought for us is that it's moved the whole growing season back. And that is, it started it early and it's finished it early.
Yeah, I know with
And-
the 14, we finished here at Montebello
on the 24th of September.
24th of which
Everything was done.
which
Yeah.
was more than a month ahead of
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, we've gone to the 13th of November. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah, and
this is-
the big difference is, or we're seeing that big difference more here at Montebello than we are in Sonoma, and that's because the fog seems to be moving further up the valleys, the Dry Creek Valley, Russian River Valley, in Sonoma, Alexander Valley, and so there's not those, like John mentioned about the 13 vintage, no big heat spikes, and that's the same thing happened in 14. So it's kind of stretching out the harvest a little bit in our Sonoma vineyards.
It's actually kind of nice.
Yeah,
Especially
absolutely.
to have those mild, fall days. Yeah, it just helps with evening out the ripeness.
But here at Montebello, especially in the winery, when Zinfandel's late, Cabernet's early, that's the problem.
That's just when things are crazy.
Yeah, and so climate change sounds very challenging because, are these permanent changes that we're seeing, or is this just a temporal change that we'll see more changes?
I think what we're really seeing, besides, something like the warmer summer we just had, it's the variation. I mean, look at all you guys on the East Coast or the Midwest. I mean, these last two winters, let alone other, weather elements, are really unusual, and not 50-year or 100-year, And that's what we're seeing is this variation year to year that we never used to see, extremes. And here we're actually expecting, the models show us that we're also going to get years of really heavy rain, where it's going to run off into the bay, into the ocean. And so we're digging retention ponds to try to capture that, to get it back into the aquifer before it runs off.
We're waiting for that though. We haven't seen
We haven't seen that.
It'll be next winter.
Our first
coming, it's
retention
coming.
pond.
All right.
Flood.
So let's now move to the two Bordeaux varieties from the 12 vintage here from the Montebello vineyard. Paul, anything you want to say specifically about 12 before we taste the wines?
I'd say that just what we mentioned about the drought, that is still a cold winter and therefore not an early harvest. The other thing is that for us, many people in California feel the 12 was a really good vintage, but when they got to 13, it was just superb for everybody. We feel that 12 was absolutely up there with the top vintages. And so for us, 12, 13, 14, as we said earlier, is just a toss-up. But so what it means is for us, 12 was an exceptionally good vintage.
And really, I mean, because of the carryover from 10 and 11 being really wet years and cold, I mean, we went into 12, the first year of drought, with some water still on the ground, and then had that nice growing season, mild summer, warm but not hot, and just perfect ripening in the month of September. And it was a fast-paced harvest, though. This was a year where, you know, it was coming in at the same time as Zinfandel, and we did start to see some water stress right towards the end of the harvest. So actually, if you look at the ingredient line for, not the Merlot, but for the State Cab, there's 2.5% water addition. So there was this requirement on some of the blocks where we couldn't get in fast enough to pick to do some corrections there in the fermenter. But the Merlot, the only thing we really had to correct there is the acidity. Some of the blocks that go into this wine down at the very bottom of Montebello at the Klein Ranch, those blocks really hold on to their acid very well, and there's usually not much malate left to burn off any of the acidity during the malolactic. So if those lots are left uncorrected with calcium carbonate, you know, those lots will be 3.3 pH as finished wine, and that's pretty tart. So
And
we did
with
step
the tannin,
in.
it's just too much.
Tannin and really firm acid, it's just too much. It makes for an unsensuous wine. So in the fermenter, on those really acidic blocks, we did add a little bit of calcium carbonate to help bring the pH up just slightly. But still, it's on the acidic side as a wine, but that's really wonderful to have natural acidity. You know, it makes it more compatible with food. It also just brightens up the nose of the wine.
It really is a nice contrast from a lot of the other Merlots in California, which come from valley vineyards, floor vineyards, or that are richer and plusher. This is such a nice contrast.
This is all just hillside grown, limestone subsoil, cool climates of the Santa Cruz Mountains. So you just have all that complexity really showing in the nose and on the palate. So we did have to watch tannin extraction this year. Luckily, it wasn't as tannic as some vintages. But maceration times were on the shorter side. We pressed early. Most of the press wine was held out in order to keep it a nice, balanced, sensuous wine. And then we gave it 2 years of barrel age using American oak barrels.
And you know, typically you'll sometimes hear from Europe, particularly Bordeaux, that Merlot is a softer varietal, and it, you know, for some people they don't see it as having the structure and the quality of, say, Cabernet. For us, it is. We have to be as careful in extracting tannins from the Merlot as we do Cabernet. It can have every bit as much.
Extra day of maceration, if you don't press, it could just turn it into a really just gnarly wine with a lot of tannin.
So for us, Merlot is right up there with Cabernet.
Well, and we see it when we do the Montebello assemblage, blind taste, all the lots, you know, all the varieties being compared to each other. Some of those Merlots are bigger than the Cabernet.
So Eric, our audience pays very close attention. So they want to know why there's 5% French oak in this wine.
Oh, and the let's see.
Somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
Well,
what
I
we
mean,
do.
it's just in some probably it was older, retired Montebello barrels.
Oh,
you know,
so
the
it-
few.
okay.
We always bring a little bit of French oak into the Montebello cellar to experiment with. And,
So it's
Yeah.
for testing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Comparative purpose.
Well, every year with the Montebello,
Yeah.
we have 3 to 5%
Yeah.
French oak with the Montebello and the estate.
Yeah.
We have 3 to 5% in the Montebello new French oak
Yes.
against 95% or 97% American oak. And we bottle up a little bit of our 2 or 3, but French Coopers, and put it aside as we do with the American Coopers to prove to ourselves
Yeah,
that,
taste later
that
on and
really the Montebello vineyard works better with American oak than it does French oak. So that's where that little bit of French oak
Yeah.
comes from, is the barrels that were retired
Right.
and that were French oak.
Yeah.
Well, like
So-
given
It's
the
our
cost
spice
of those
rack.
French oak barrels, you don't want to retire them after 1 year.
That's right.
No, we hold them usually 5 years. You
Yeah.
know, they're about $1,500 a
Yeah.
piece versus a really well-made American oak barrel at $450.
Use that.
But I should say
Yeah.
this, that when we started using American oak we had always used well-tempered American and French in the 60s. But as I came in 69 and so by 70, and we were buying just a couple of French oak barrels, and then we were buying, for the first time, new American oak barrels. And at that point, even though shipped over the French barrels made up in a cardboard box to keep them from getting dinged, paying the duties, paying the freight from Bordeaux, they were they were only, I think, $10, $15 more for a bigger barrel than the American oak. They were $50 delivered here. The American oak was $35 delivered here, a barrel.
Yeah.
And you know, now
Oh,
we're
they're
at the American's gone up
1,500.
to 14, and the French has gone up to, what'd you say?
Well, $1,500.
$1,500.
Yeah.
So what
So-
you're saying that it wasn't a cost consideration.
It wasn't
when-
a cost
Okay.
consideration. It was
Yeah.
a chauvinistic consideration of you don't use French oak in a California wine.
There you
If American oak works as well or better, our case
Which
better.
it works well, but we're
Yeah.
very careful with the cooperages we work with in American oak.
It's not any
Yeah.
American oak.
No. It's really the best of the
And we have
cooperages.
tried and rejected, or tried
we
and
have tried,
continued
yeah.
with, and it varies. Some big cooperages have been in favor for years with us, and then have dropped out of
Yeah.
favor if their quality has dropped off. So every year it's a matter of blind
And
tasting
it's-
the different
Yeah, and
oaks.
it's a diverse mix. We never bring in a dominant number of one particular cooperage into the cellar.
It's a
You know,
mix.
it's always mixed. There's at least 20 to 30 different barrel types in the Montebello cellar. You know,
Terrific.
all
Because
American.
otherwise you're turning your wine over to the cooper
Yeah.
instead of retaining it yourself.
But in the case of the estate wines, we only use a certain amount that's new. You know, usually 40% is new oak.
Okay.
Then we use 1 2-year-old barrels, kind of the retired Montebello barrels
For the balance.
for the balance, so
Okay.
that in the end it incorporates flavor into the wine and yet doesn't become too dominant. Because the estate wines are made up of the lots that have really good fruit focus and balance, and they are softer wines, and we really have to watch the oak extraction closely to avoid over extraction of oak.
So the next one, Eric, is the 2012 Estate Cabernet, and this is interestingly, it's a quite interesting parallel with what's happened with the Chardonnay in terms of we have a small release here again on the 12
Yes.
Estate Cabernet, and it's not because it was a small Cabernet vintage, but because it was so
It
high
was on
quality.
the
What happened?
Smaller side as far as harvest. I mean, we didn't have any exceptionally large yields in the vineyard.
Right. It wasn't below average. though.
No.
Yeah.
But it was definitely a year where the Montebello selection was really wonderful.
So
you
we
know,
have a
and
smaller spring release of the Estate Cab and a larger
fall release of the 12 Montebello.
Okay.
But not by a huge amount of extra Montebello. I mean,
Nobody's complaining.
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't like the Chardonnay where it was
Yeah, it's
limited
not
and the
50.
quantity went way up. It's, you know,
yeah.
Montebello is still you know, in that.
Yeah, we only
Middle
picked about
ground.
189 tons off the vineyard in 2012. So not huge yields. I think it averaged about 1.4 tons per acre.
Yeah, the last, besides 2014, was a more normal year for Cabernet up here.
Okay.
The last year that we had a normal year besides 14 was 2010. So
Oh, it's been a while.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
been a while.
Yeah.
It's been below normal.
And are we seeing the yields go up as some of the new plantings come on stream? Is that increasing the tons per acre?
I haven't
Not
seen
yet.
that just yet.
too young.
Yeah.
They're still
it's gonna
too
be
young.
a
Have to
few
drop
more
a lot
years
of
out.
crop if they
To get
if they
to
produce
get the
too-
intensity?
Yeah.
Okay.
This year, David.
Yeah.
This year, okay.
Yeah.
And those younger vines, I mean, we blind taste them, and so like
Yeah.
we've had younger Franc,
yeah,
which
the
is
young-
just beautiful and
amazing
has
stuff.
come into the Montebello.
Right.
But in general, we expect the younger vines. I mean, they'll all be given a chance
Yeah.
Right.
because of that
Some
early
blocks,
intensity.
Yeah, depending on where they are on the mountain. We have right below us and at the kind of the Cliff block and the Foster's blocks. Those have, so far as young vines have come
And
into
made
the
Montebello.
into the selection. They just have, they're just in that sweet spot on the mountain with the limestone really close to the roots.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah. But yeah, this is all whole berry fermented. And actually we sorted quite a bit of the fruit with our Mistral sorting
Shifting
equipment.
to the estate.
Yeah, to the estate, yeah.
Estate Cabernet. Yeah.
So, you know, destemmed and then berry sorted and then whole berry fermented down in small fermenters in the winery on natural yeast. And here we just really had to watch over the tannin extraction closely. So doing at the start full pump overs, but then tapering off to non-action, really just circulating the juice under the cap for several days to get the fermentation to dryness, to then press off. And then have a chance to then taste the press wines and select the finest press lots for the blend. And in the end, we actually held quite a bit of press wine out of this blend, and that's still sitting in barrel up at the winery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're thinking about
Yeah.
the fact that it is such excellent first press. The Montebello couldn't use it; it was already structured.
Right.
That we're going to put out for the first time a state first press,
First press,
or Cabernet first press, something like that.
Yeah.
And because it is so good, and press wine, as you know, can be one of the most complexing ingredients that go into the final line.
Yeah.
Are we going to
So-
trademark that name?
Yeah, the first, I don't know about first press if you can trademark that,
Yeah.
but that would be a tough one.
You have to talk to our attorneys on that.
Yeah.
one. Well, great. A couple of just sort of stray questions that we didn't get to through the tasting from our audience. And one, this is for you, David, is the impact of the drought on older vines. Are they more or less impacted by the drought?
roots
So
are deeper.
it's they can. That's a great question. I would say they're probably less impacted by the lack of water, but what we saw last year. So this is the 2013, December of 2013. So the last year's dormant season was very dry. We had virtually no rain in December of 2013, but then we had this pretty cold snap that came through for a few days. It was down to 17 degrees in Geyserville and Lytton. And what we saw with old vines that we didn't see with young vines is that they lost some arms. They actually died, and it was basically winter kill, which you hardly ever see in California. Young vines, not so much. I mean, it might have hurt the primary bud, but they seem to be a little bit more resilient. Now that might have been because we gave them a little water after harvest, a little extra water after harvest, but we irrigated the old vines after harvest too, which I feel is essential to keep the health of the vines up. And that was a phenomenon that you saw in old vine vineyards throughout the state because it got cold. It was a statewide freeze. Benny Ducey down in Paso, he lost some arms and some vines. Talking with some friends in the industry, Lodi, all the old vines in Lodi were hammered by it. The only old vines that kind of escaped were up in the foothills because it didn't quite get as cold. Yeah. While they can handle the lack of rain probably better than young vines, that cold dry is not good for them. So you know, it's just bad news all the way around.
So David, quickly, you just mentioned that after harvest, we love to see some late November, early December rains, because I take it that moisture sort of tells the vine that the next year it can go ahead and set a good crop. So,
yeah, well, what it is, or what happens that ideally is that the vines still have some green leaves on them after harvest, and then with a rain or with an irrigation, if we don't get a rain, we try, if we have the irrigation capability, we give it some irrigation. That helps keep those leaves on a little bit longer. Those leaves are making sugars. Those sugars, carbohydrates, go directly down to the root system, and for the first month and a half or so of the growing season, the spring growing season, the vine is living off its reserves. The leaves are too small to make enough sugar and carbohydrates to go back and feed the vines. So it's not until the leaves are really big and the vines are up, it's going to be another couple weeks up in Sonoma before they reach that point where there's a net gain of carbohydrates to the plant. So it's essential to keep those leaves on and green if you can.
And get them going.
Yes.
Yeah. This is more of a marketing question for you, Paul. Why don't we utilize a more substantial organic label on the East Bench? Why just a back label note? Why not something more prominent?
yeah, and part of it is what I said earlier, that organically grown, just that statement, only tells you about the grapes. It doesn't tell you about what chemical additions were made in the winery or processes. And so we don't want to make a big thing out of that. For those that are interested, it's a fact, but that alone isn't very meaningful to us. What is meaningful is that in combination with listing your ingredients and showing the fact that you did not add a number of the 60 approved additives to your wine, concentrates, additives, processes, so on. So that's really the reason we don't make a big deal out of it.
Okay, terrific. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our tasting this morning. I want to thank Eric, David, Paul, John for joining us. Thank you to our audience for your attention and tasting through our wines, and for all the good questions. And we look forward to seeing you in the fall for our fall virtual tasting. So thank you again, and have a great weekend.